The day didn't bode well for me. I had been a truck driver for several years and was used to the routine of driving from Chicago to Michigan and back. The job was my life: long roads, overnight trips, short meetings with other drivers at gas stations, and of course, the warehouses where I was constantly loading and unloading goods. To be honest, I even felt comfortable in this rhythm. I have never been attracted to office routine or any overly social professions where you need to constantly communicate with people. I believed that the road was mine. That day, I arrived again at one of the warehouses in Michigan. It was nothing special, just a standard procedure. I drove up, checked in, and got in line to unload. I had been here dozens of times before, if not hundreds. I knew almost all of the employees by sight, although I didn't remember their names and didn't try to. Among those people was Emma, the food selection operator. Slender, with big green eyes, she was always busy with something and rarely paid attention to me. Or so it seemed to me. My truck was full of frozen food, and this run was one of the more standard ones. Everything was going as usual, until during the unloading process it turned out that some of the goods were damaged. The frozen food was partially defrosted and some packages were torn. It was a real disaster for me. The truck was leaving the loading point in perfect condition, and I couldn't understand how it happened. But the fact was a fact, and I realized that this was a problem. Discussions began in the warehouse about who was to blame and what to do now. Of course, all eyes were on me. Although, to be honest, I had no desire to justify myself. I was not used to explaining my actions, especially if I was sure that I was not to blame. But then Emma came up to me, the same girl I hadn't noticed much before. I didn't know what was ahead of me, but I was sure of one thing: I was now free, albeit without everything that had once made me who I was. My story with Emma and Tom was over, but with it came an important chapter in my life. Now I had to find a way to start over, even if it meant starting from scratch. Leaving the city behind, I set out on a road I didn't know. My future plans were unclear, but I was determined not to look back. New challenges, new paths awaited me, and maybe someday I would find myself again, even after all these losses. This story ended in a completely different way than I could have ever imagined. Everything I thought was unshakable crumbled before my eyes. My marriage, my home, my career, all of it was gone, and I was standing on the threshold of a new life, with no clear plans and no idea what was coming next. However, despite all this pain and loss, I realized one important thing: even from the darkest moments, you can learn lessons that will help you become stronger and wiser. To summarize everything that happened and to give advice to other men, I want to share a few conclusions that I have come to through my experience. My life with Emma was built on trust. I trusted her unconditionally, and I believed that she also treated me with the same feeling. But sometimes we forget that trust doesn't have to be blind. Trust is something we build together with our partner. But it also requires attention and care. If something doesn't feel right, you shouldn't ignore those feelings. Intuition often tells us more than we are willing to admit. If you notice changes in your partner's behavior, don't be afraid to discuss it. Don't wait for suspicions to turn into anger and frustration. It is important to communicate and find answers to questions before they become an insurmountable obstacle in the relationship. Time is one of the most valuable things we can give to our loved ones. Because of my job as a trucker, I was often away from home. And although I always tried to make up for it when I returned, it was not enough. The lack of constant presence and shared moments creates a gap in the relationship that can gradually grow. For men, especially those who work on the road or have unpredictable schedules, it is important to understand that your life together needs constant care. Even if you work for the benefit of your family, don't forget to pay attention to your partner. Shared moments are what strengthen relationships, and they cannot be replaced by material goods. Anger is a natural reaction to infidelity, but it can destroy not only your relationship but also your life. I experienced this firsthand when I let my emotions take over. At the moment I saw Emma with Tom, I wasn't thinking rationally, I was just acting. And although it was an explosion of emotions, the consequences of this became extremely serious for me. Violence is never the answer, even when you are overcome with anger. I realized that I needed to be able to control my feelings and find other ways to resolve conflicts. Talking, removing yourself from the situation, seeking advice from friends or professionals are all better than giving in to impulses. My actions led to lawsuits and significant financial losses, which only made the situation worse. One of the hardest lessons I learned was the importance of financial independence. Selling my house and truck, which were generating income for me, was necessary to avoid prosecution, but it left me without a livelihood. In situations like this, it is very important to have a contingency plan. If you are completely dependent on one source of income, it can become a problem at a critical time. Always try to have a backup plan, whether it's in the form of savings or alternative income opportunities. This will give you confidence in any situation and avoid despair. After everything was over, I was left with nothing. But even in this situation, I realized that it was also an opportunity to start from scratch. Perhaps this is the most important lesson I learned from this story. Sometimes life gives us difficult challenges so that we can change and find a new path. Don't be afraid to start over, even if it seems scary. Everyone has inner strength that can help them cope with difficulties and find new meaning in life. You can always find a new path, a new goal, and a new meaning if you are ready to move forward despite all the challenges. When betrayal happens, we often start looking for reasons within ourselves. I went through this too, asking myself what I did wrong, why Emma made this choice. But the truth is that the responsibility for her actions lies with her. You cannot control another person's decisions, and you should not take the blame for their mistakes. Realize that sometimes people make bad choices, and that doesn't mean you deserve it. Accepting this is hard, but it is important for your own healing and moving forward. My story was full of pain, loss, and disappointment. But it also taught me valuable lessons that I want to share with other men. Life is never easy, and there will always be moments when you have to face difficult choices and unpredictable situations. But it's important to remember that even after the darkest night, there is a dawn. If you find yourself in a similar situation, don't be afraid to start over. Don't be afraid to let go of what you can't get back and move on. Life goes on, and you have the power to find a new path and new meaning. At this note, I would like to say thank you guys for listening and supporting. I wish you the best. Every subscribe and like will be highly appreciated. Take care. However, despite all these thoughts, there was still a bit of doubt in me. I couldn't afford to just give up my suspicions after what I had seen. If I had already started this, I had to see it through, no matter what it took. I had to be 100% sure that everything was fine in our marriage, that there were no secrets between us. That evening, as I was sitting in the kitchen thinking about all this, I received a call from the car service. The mechanic told me that my truck was already repaired and ready for use. I was relieved to hear this news. It meant that I could go back to work and at least for a while get away from all these worries and suspicions. The next morning I called a taxi and went to the service. The road was quiet, and I had time to think over all the events of the past few days. Perhaps by focusing on work, I could look at everything more objectively and get rid of this paranoia. When I arrived at the service, the mechanic met me and said that the car was now in perfect condition. It was on the move, the engine was running flawlessly, and I was ready to continue my flight. Getting behind the wheel, I felt a certain relief. The road has always helped me calm down and collect my thoughts. I started the engine and headed to the place of loading the goods. I had a long road ahead of me, and maybe this time alone would help me sort out my thoughts and finally decide whether it was worth pursuing my suspicions or just leaving them in the past. After a few days on the road, I was returning home earlier than I had planned. At first, I had no intention of making a secret of it, but as I traveled, I decided not to inform Emma of my arrival. I had a strange premonition. Something in my heart told me that it was better to show up unannounced. Maybe it was just fear, maybe it was a remnant of the suspicions that had been plaguing me in recent days. When I drove up to the house, my heart fluttered. Tom's car was parked in the yard. His black Jeep, shiny and well-maintained, was in the spot where my truck usually parked. I took a deep breath to try to calm myself down and decided to go inside. When I entered the living room, I didn't hear a sound. Everything was too quiet. Maybe Emma was out for a walk with Max or busy in the yard, I thought, trying to find an explanation for Tom's presence. But it didn't make sense. His car was parked, so he was inside. Anxiety grew inside me. I slowly climbed the stairs, trying not to make any noise. When I reached the second floor, I heard muffled laughter. It was Emma's voice, but it was not like I was used to hearing it. It was intimate, enthusiastic, gentle, something I hadn't heard in our house in a long time. My heart froze for a moment, and then fluttered like a caged bird. I knew I had to see what was happening, but I was more afraid of it than anything else in my life. Quietly creeping up to the bedroom door, I opened it enough to look inside. And what I saw shocked me more than I could have ever imagined. On the bed where Emma and I had spent so many happy nights, she was lying with Tom. They were completely naked, their bodies intertwined in a passionate embrace, as if they had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Tom was gently hugging her, kissing her neck, and she was responding with the same heat and passion that I had only ever seen in my relationship with her. Their movements were so natural, as if they had been together for a long time. My hands trembled when I saw it all. Anger, pain, and betrayal mixed in my head. My worst fears had come true. What I had tried to deny, what I thought were my paranoid thoughts, were now lying in front of me, naked and shameless. Rage began to boil inside me. Without hesitation, I pushed open the door and entered the room. Emma and Tom didn't seem to realize what was happening right away. Their faces changed when they saw me. Tom hastily pulled away from Emma, and she froze in place, shocked. Her face was distorted with fear and confusion. "What the hell are you doing in my bedroom?" I shouted as I approached Tom. My voice sounded ice cold, but I was no longer in control of my emotions. Tom stood up and tried to say something, but I wasn't listening to him anymore. My hand rose by itself, and the first punch hit him right in the jaw. He didn't even have time to react. Tom staggered from the blow, but I didn't let him fall by grabbing his shirt collar. My anger came out with every movement. "How dare you!" I hit him again, this time in the stomach. He cringed in pain, but I didn't let go. All the resentment I had been holding back was released, and I couldn't stop. Emma started screaming, trying to intervene between us, but I pushed her aside. My eyes were full of rage and my heart was beating like crazy. My hand continued to hit Tom until he fell to the floor, almost powerless to resist. "Jack, stop. Please stop," Emma screamed, but her voice was distant now, almost unintelligible to me. I only stopped when I saw that Tom was no longer getting up. He was lying on the floor, breathing heavily, blood flowing from his split lip. The room was deafeningly silent, broken only by Emma's heavy breathing and soft sobs. I looked at her, her eyes were full of tears, but I no longer saw in them what had once held us together. All our years, all our shared memories, all of it now turned to ashes. "I don't want to see you anymore," I said coldly, addressing her. Emma tried to say something, her lips trembling, but I wasn't listening. I had left them there, broken and betrayed, in a place that had once been my home, but now was only a stage for their betrayal. As I left Emma and Tom in the house where my life had once been, I felt my anger gradually fade away, leaving only emptiness. I left without a clear goal, just trying to get away from this nightmare that had suddenly become a reality. My thoughts were scattered, and I couldn't focus on one thing. The whole world around me seemed unreal, as if I existed in some other dimension where nothing mattered. The next days were a blur. I slept in my truck in parking lots, ate random snacks, and tried to avoid human contact. I didn't want to think about the future, about what would happen next. However, the reality soon made itself felt when I received an official letter. Tom was suing me for battery. The charges were serious, and the prospect of going to jail became extremely real. His lawyer described everything in detail: physical injuries, mental suffering, medical expenses, the list was long. I was not prepared for this. My anger and rage seemed justified at the time, but now I was facing the threat of losing not only everything I had left, but also my freedom. I met with my lawyer, who was frank. The situation was complicated, and the court might not find in my favor. Several years in prison was not something that could be ruled out of the probable outcome. We discussed the options, and the only way out seemed to be to try to settle the case before the trial. But this required money, and a lot of it. I realized that now I had almost nothing left. My marriage had collapsed, and what I considered my home was now just a reminder of betrayal. But this house still had monetary value. I made a difficult decision. I had to sell the house that Emma and I had bought. It was the only thing left to do. The selling process was painful. Every corner of this house reminded me of our life together, of our dreams and plans that were now destroyed. But I knew I couldn't leave it as it was. The house had to be sold, and quickly. The real estate agent I was working with said that in order to sell it quickly, I would have to lower the price, but I didn't care. I wanted to get rid of this place. Like an unpleasant memory that cuts my heart. After a few weeks, a buyer was found on the market. The amount I received was considerable, but it did not cover the emotional losses I had experienced. It seemed that with every paper I signed, I was cutting off a piece of my past life, erasing it forever. But the money from the sale of the house was not enough. So I had to take another step that I never thought I would have to take: sell my truck. This truck was more than just a means of earning money. It was my life, my livelihood. Every mile I drove it was a part of me, a part of my freedom. But now this freedom was slipping out of my hands. I found a buyer pretty quickly. Trucks were always in demand. When I handed over the keys, I felt like I was losing not only the truck, but also part of my identity. I was no longer the Jack I knew before. Now I was a man without a home, without a livelihood, and without the woman I once loved more than anything. The money from the sale of the truck was enough to cover all the costs of settling the case before trial. Tom agreed to a deal in which I paid him a substantial sum in exchange for him dropping the charges. It was a tough decision, but I knew it was the only way to avoid jail time. The procedure was quick. My lawyer, together with Tom's lawyer, agreed on all the details, and I just had to sign the documents. The moment I signed, I had a strange feeling. On the one hand, it was the end of one of the most difficult periods in my life. On the other hand, it was the beginning of a new, unknown stage for which I was not ready. After everything was settled, I was left with nothing. The house, the truck, Emma, all of that was in the past. I stood on the threshold of the unknown, and the only thing I knew for sure was that my life would never be the same again. I was now free from prosecution, but at what cost? I had lost everything I had. Left alone, I realized that I needed to move on, to leave this city, this pain and betrayal behind. But where to go, what to do? I had no answers to these questions. I decided not to jump to conclusions, and certainly not to start another fight. Instead, I decided to follow Emma to get answers to all the questions that were tormenting me. I returned to the kitchen and pretended to mind my own business, watching them out of the corner of my eye. Emma and Tom talked for a few more minutes, then he got into his Jeep and drove away, leaving her in the yard. She lingered for a moment, looking after him, and then went back into the house. I went out to meet her, trying to keep my composure. She smiled at me as if nothing had happened, but I had already decided that I would not let this situation go unresolved. "Hey, where have you been?" "I made you breakfast," I said, hiding the tension in my voice. "Oh, hi, Jack." "Thank you, that's so sweet of you," she replied, and we went upstairs to the bedroom together, where she sat down to eat. Her behavior was familiar, but I couldn't forget what I had seen. I spent the rest of the day trying not to give away my suspicions. I was haunted by the urge to bring her to justice, but I knew now was not the time. I waited, I watched, and now my goal was clear. I would follow her and find out the truth. Over the next few days, I watched Emma closely, trying to catch any hints that she was hiding something. I carefully tracked her every move, every call, every meeting. However, to my surprise, her behavior was completely normal. She was doing household chores, talking to her neighbors, and occasionally going for a walk with Max. Everything seemed so normal that I began to doubt my suspicions. Maybe I was just winding myself up. Maybe this situation with the chain and her reaction to my questions were just a coincidence. I began to think that maybe I had overestimated the situation. Emma was the same woman I knew and loved, and all these days I had been watching her. Nothing had changed in her behavior. Maybe I was really wrong, and I was wrong to suspect her of something untoward. After making eggs and coffee, I put everything on a tray and was going to take it to her bedroom, hoping that this would be a good start to reconciliation. But when I entered the bedroom, I found that Emma was no longer there. The bed was neatly made, which meant that she had been awake for some time. I was a little surprised, but figured that maybe she had just gone for a walk with Max or had already gone down to the kitchen to start the day. Leaving the breakfast tray on the nightstand, I decided to go downstairs to find her. As I walked down the stairs, I noticed movement outside the window. As I got closer, I saw Tom standing in the yard, apparently coming to check on his employees. I thought that now, in the early morning hours, he was just inspecting the project or giving instructions, but then my attention shifted to the fact that Emma was standing next to him. She was clearly saying something to him, and I saw them exchange a few words. I could feel the anxiety starting to build inside me, but I tried to stay calm. It was just a discussion about work, I told myself. But something about their interaction alerted me. Then I noticed that Emma was holding the same gold chain that had caused us to have such a heated argument last night. I froze as I watched her hand it to Tom. He took it, smiling, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. The sight was like a slap in the face. All the questions that had tormented me yesterday came to the surface again, but this time with even more force. How did she get it? Why did she give it to him? Inside, I felt a wave of anger begin to rise. I clenched my fists, trying not to give in to my emotions and explode right then and there. We had already had a fight last night, and it didn't end well. So this time I decided to act differently. My thoughts were chaotic, but one idea gradually became clearer and clearer. I had to find out what was really going on. I felt a wave of indignation rising in me. Her answer sounded too uncertain, and it only reinforced my suspicions. I want the truth, Emma. I exploded, unable to contain my anger any longer. This isn't just a chain, you know that as well as I do. It's just the two of us here, and no one else could have left it. What's going on here? Emma stubbornly held her ground, but I could see her face turning pale and tears forming in her eyes. She took a step back, as if she felt she could no longer control the situation. I already told you, Jack. Her voice was quiet but angry. I don't know where this chain came from. And I don't understand why you're making such a big deal out of it. I'm not going to make excuses for something I didn't do. Do you think I'm a fool? I couldn't help myself. This chain is here for a reason, and you know it. Who is it from? What happens in our house while I'm away? Emma sighed sharply, walked nervously around the room, but did not answer. My thoughts were already wandering far from the calm, serene picture we had built with her. And something told me that this night would be sleepless. The next morning, when I woke up with a heavy feeling after our fight yesterday, I realized that I had to take the first step towards reconciliation. Emma always appreciated it when I made breakfast for her, so I decided to start the day that way. I could still hear the echoes of yesterday's events in my head, but I tried to push them away. It was important to focus on restoring harmony in our home. While I was cooking, I thought about how everything had gone wrong so quickly. Emma and I have always been good problem solvers, but this chain situation had gotten out of hand. I decided that the best way to fix it was to just talk to her, to let her know that I was on her side, that I wanted to figure it out and make it right. Although this was not part of my plans, I agreed you can't go on a trip without a working truck. I called a taxi and decided to go home, as I still had a whole week before the repairs were completed. When I arrived home, it was already late. Emma met me on the doorstep and I could tell she was surprised. She looked excited, even a little anxious. Why are you back so early? What happened? She asked, trying to understand the reason for my unexpected arrival. I told her about the truck breaking down, that it would take a whole week to fix, and that I had just decided to come home while it was all sorted out. We sat down to dinner, and gradually her excitement seemed to subside. Dinner went smoothly, and afterwards we went to the bedroom. In the bedroom, while undressing, I accidentally noticed something unusual on the bedside table. There was a gold chain there. It was very strange, because neither Emma nor I had ever worn gold jewelry. Something inside me was alerted, and I couldn't ignore it. When I saw that gold chain on the nightstand, an alarm went off in my head. It was something completely out of character for us. Neither Emma nor I had ever worn gold jewelry, especially since neither of us attached much importance to such things. The chain looked expensive and was clearly not a random item that just happened to be on our nightstand. I picked up the chain and showed it to Emma. "Where did this come from?" I asked, trying not to show my surprise even though I was already starting to gag inside. Emma stopped, looking at me and then at the chain. I saw her swallow nervously, her face tense. She looked away and started searching inside herself, as if she was looking for the right words. "I don't know, Jack," she finally said, but her voice sounded unnatural, too cold. Maybe it was left behind by the guests or the masters. I wasn't paying attention. I was glad that we found such a specialist, because renovating the house was an important step for us. We wanted everything to be done right from the start. That day I was getting ready for a flight to California. Work has always required focus, and I was glad that Emma decided to go with Tom to the hardware store. She had great taste and always knew what to choose, so I was at ease. I trusted her decision, knowing that she would make sure everything was in the best possible way. When they returned home, I was almost finishing my preparations for leaving. Emma was in high spirits, and that made me happy. "What are you so happy about?" I asked with a smile, noticing how she was beaming. "Oh, Jack, it's been a great day," she replied, her voice sounding happy. "I had such a great time with Tom, he really knows his stuff. We chose some great materials and I can't wait to see the results." Her enthusiasm was so energizing for me. I was glad she was so happy with the process, and even more convinced that our house was going to be okay. I was happy to think that when I got back from the flight, I would see our house becoming exactly what we had envisioned. The next morning, I took another flight, planning to load the goods. It seemed like a normal trip, but life always has its own plans. Halfway through the trip, the truck broke down. At first, I tried to deal with the problem myself, but nothing worked. I called the emergency service, and they tried to repair the truck on the spot, but the breakdown was more complicated than it seemed. In the end, we decided to have the truck towed to the nearest service. I was so caught up in all these events that I completely forgot to let Emma know what had happened. Eventually, after arriving at the service, the mechanics told me that the repair would take about a week. Later, we decided to get a dog so that we would have someone to meet us after long days at work. It was a golden retriever we named Max. He became a part of our family, and his boundless energy filled our home with life. Our life was simple, but it had its own beauty. Work, dinner at home, walks with Max, meetings with neighbors, all of this became part of our daily existence. But despite all our efforts, we realized that the house needed professional help. That's when we decided to turn to a landscape designer to make a plan to restore our house and the surrounding area. The designer we hired turned out to be quite talented. He came up with several ideas that we liked, and we were looking forward to implementing them. The project included a new garden, landscaping, new driveways, and even a small pond. We were inspired by this plan. The house, which at the beginning seemed abandoned and old, was slowly transforming into a place where we wanted to live our lives. And although there was still a lot of work to be done, I felt we were on the right track. Emma seemed happy. We often discussed what our house would look like when all the work was done. We planned every step together, and it strengthened our relationship even more. I was sure that with this woman I could overcome any difficulties. Tom was the kind of person who made an impression at first sight. His brand new Jeep, expensive suit, and impeccable perfume scent immediately commanded my respect. He looked like a man who knew what he was doing, and that only strengthened my confidence in our choice. Emma and I wanted our home to be in good hands, and Tom seemed like the kind of professional who could make our dreams come true. When we signed the contract, Tom calmly and confidently outlined his plan. His team had a lot of experience in similar projects, and I realized that everything would be done at a high level. I didn't know what to say to that. Her words were unexpected but pleasant. I smiled and answered, "Well, sometimes we can really surprise." That day I left the warehouse with the feeling that I had met someone special. Perhaps I did not fully realize at the time that this meeting would change my life. But on the way home, when I remembered her confident voice and those green eyes, I realized that I wanted to see her again. That I had to see her again. That's how my story with Lisa began. Although we were from different worlds, me, a trucker from Chicago, and her, a warehouse worker in Michigan, we had something in common. Something stronger than the distance and difference in our lives. Something that made me believe that this woman was the one I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. With Emma, our life began to take on new colors, and it made me happy. After that incident in the warehouse, we started talking more often, and with each conversation I was convinced that she was special. Her direct but not harsh way of communicating, her intelligence and ability to solve problems not only at work but also in life, admired me. And when it came time to make a decision, we decided to move in together. We chose a small house in Michigan that was being auctioned off. It wasn't in the best condition, but we saw potential in it. Located on the outskirts of a small town, it had a certain charm, although it needed a lot of renovation. We bought it at a bargain price, and I felt that this was our chance to build something of our own from scratch. The first few months after moving in were a real challenge. The house needed repairs in almost every room. The roof was leaking, the floor was creaking, and the walls needed a new coat of paint. But we were not afraid. In the evenings, after work, I would take my tools and start repairing, and Emma would help with what she could. Together we did our best to make our house cozy and comfortable. "Is there a problem with the cargo?" she said, as if she had hit the nail on the head. "Yes, it turns out that something went wrong," I answered, trying not to show irritation, although I was boiling inside. "The cargo was fine when I received it." "Well, now we're going to have to find out," she said, her voice firm, without a hint of pity. "You do realize this is serious, right? The food is spoiled, and we can't accept it." I looked at her with a challenge. "And what do you suggest?" I asked, although, to be honest, I did not expect a constructive answer. Emma did not flinch. She looked at me with her piercing green eyes, and I felt myself starting to lose ground under her gaze. "My proposal is simple," she said. "Let's look at the situation from a different angle. I'm sure we can find a solution. But it will require a slight change in approach." Her tone was so confident that I suddenly found myself wanting to hear what she had to say. It was strange. Jack, a man who was used to being in control, suddenly surrendered to this fragile but very confident woman. We started discussing solutions to the problem. Her ideas were practical and logical, and I began to realize that I was facing a person who not only knew her business, but also knew how to find a common language even in difficult situations. Our verbal skirmish gradually turned into a constructive dialogue. With every word, I realized that Emma was not just another warehouse worker I see once a month. She was interesting, smart, and most importantly, honest. I was impressed by her determination and at the same time her calm confidence in her actions. We solved the problem with the cargo, and when everything was settled, Emma suddenly said, "You know, Jack, I've always thought that drivers are people who live their own lives and are hard to understand. But today I see that this is not true."